Thanks. Good discussions. I'm sorry to push things, to move things forward, or to be so schedule bound, but we have, I guess, about a little more than an hour and 15 minutes to solve all the problems we talked about in the last day and a half. So, and I think that's we want to solve all those problems so that you have a decent weekend. So. We don't want you going home carrying these problems with you as extra baggage. So I wanted to talk as kind of a transition to the next discussion group to identify some of the threats and challenges, the major threats and challenges that I see in the library or the community's ability to ensure long-term integrity and accessibility of government-produced information and government records. I've been using that longer form of the word preservation, the long-term integrity and accessibility of materials, because I think that's really what we're talking about. Preservation almost doesn't mean anything in the born digital realm, because preservation was the assumption of preservation is that something stays the same, something's maintained exactly as it was when it was produced, and the digital content and the environment in which digital content is managed and created and used is very hard on the idea of permanence and persistence. So there are a number of threats and challenges. I listed 7 when I was sitting over there a minute ago. One is just the scale of the challenge, the sheer volume of information, sheer volume of government records being produced now, the sheer volume of data being collected and disseminated by governments, whether it's the U.S. government, the Canadian government, or the government of Brazil, or the government of Kenya. Just mammoth amounts of content are being produced, and this is unprecedented. If we compare it, a couple of the speakers have compared it to the amount of government records that were produced in the paper era, and you can see it's different by an order of magnitude. So there's really almost no relationship to it. Also, in the amount of material and data being used by scholars and by researchers like Matthew Connolly, who are now dealing with really millions of pages of content now. I mean, with computer-assisted research, you're no longer reading. It's what you're doing is using various applications to analyze what's there and to organize what's there and that kind of thing. And so, in that sense, we have this big problem or big challenge. It's actually a great thing. Of the scale of volume of government information being produced and the scale of the volume of government produced information being used. So something we've really never dealt with before. Number 2, the known unknowns. We don't know even the scope of what we're talking about in terms of government records, in terms of government produced information. James Jacobs' paper in his presentation made that very clear, that we don't see the perimeter of the material that we're talking about. If you're talking about preservation and we're talking about long-term persistence, the model for libraries, particularly research library collection development in the past and preservation, is always assumed that we know the totality of what's out there, or we know how big the totality. That's enabled us to decide how much in the way of resources to allocate to the management and acquisition and preservation of the material. It's enabled us to decide how much, to what extent we have to prioritize, or to figure out how to prioritize what's worth saving, what's worth retaining, what's worth maintaining, that kind of thing. And that the known unknowns is that we don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we know, and that's going to be very challenging. It makes it very challenging to frame a preservation strategy. Number 3, there's really doesn't seem to be any clear distinction between documents, what's a government document and what's a government record anymore. It used to be a lot clearer, but when the presentations by the representatives of the National Archives and the Library and Archives Canada yesterday, and the presentations by people like Thomas Blanton and Matthew Connolly showed that these are almost being, in the digital realm, these things are almost interchangeable. There are certain things now, certain digital government documents that are fixed and need to be fixed, because if you're talking about a law and you're taking somebody to court, you want that law to read the same way today that it read 3 months ago when you hired the lawyer. So there are certain things that are fixed, and you could say that they're government documents, those kinds of things. But there's an awful lot of material that falls in the gray area. I remember asking somebody from the government printing office, is the White House website a government publication, an agency publication, or is it a government record? They said, oh, it's a government record. And then I asked somebody from the National Archives, is that the government record or government document? Oh, it's a government document. And so it's really not clear. I mean, the boundaries between these things are really very mutable. Fourth thing, we are facing, as we found in the essay, a real reduction in the capability of the big organizations that have traditionally been entrusted with the preservation of government information long term, with the scaling back of funding or reduced funding or diminished funding of the organizations like the GPO and the National Archives, at the same time as they're being asked to do more, much more with government information, means that they are going to be able to do, probably less than they did before. It's clear that the FedSys repository isn't covering nearly all, even the fixed government publications, the government-produced information. There are, and that's not just for reasons of economics, it's also for reasons of statutory authority of the GPO. They just don't have that authority, or at least enough authority to do that kind of thing. And so I think that NARA and GPO will be playing different roles in the future. And I think that's actually exciting to think about that, to think about how the role of NARA could change from being a place where government records go when the agencies are ready to give them up, to a place that's an active collaborator with the government agencies in the decisions on systems used and adopted to produce government communications, government records, and those kinds of things. And it sounds like there's been a start to that process with the guidelines that the NARA has been able to give the government agencies, those kinds of things. The reduction in funding clearly is, in the library world, is painfully apparent to all of us. Most library institutions don't have the kinds of resources they had years ago to devote to preservation. That's a result partly of a certain amount of radical reductions in public funding at the state level, as well as national level, but also to a certain extent it's a function of different priorities of the higher education organizations themselves. The research libraries, as in the world of research libraries, we used to play a very big, important civic role, which was to be the stewards of information, content, evidence that no one else was prepared to be stewards of. We did things and took care of things not because they were directly needed or immediately needed by people, the undergraduates on campus today, but that they would be needed by historians in the future. There's so many financial pressures being put on research libraries these days to do other things or to not do that, and so there's less money left over for the things that have a return, as some librarians say, return on investment far in the future, which in that return may be something along the lines of a Nobel Prize or a big book by one of your faculty, but it's very often we're required to pay attention to faculty member or the dean or the undergraduate that's on our doorstep instead of thinking that far ahead. So the reduction in the capabilities, I think, of library parent organizations to support preservation on the scale that we're talking about is a big thing. At the same time, the tech companies are playing a much larger role. The cloud is playing a much larger role in, if not the long-term maintenance of digital content, digital government content, certainly in the short-term maintenance of it, in the not just the, in the storage of digital content, in even providing services for the use and discoverability of that content. You can think of the social media organizations like Facebook and YouTube as repositories these days, and they are de facto repositories of an awful lot of content. And the good news is that content hasn't disappeared, and the bad news is it might very well disappear. So their business interests are different than the interests of historians and policy researchers. The private market-oriented organizations as well, organizations like ProQuest and EastView, seem to be playing a bigger role, and they seem to need to play a bigger role. They need to have increasingly the organizations that are mediating use of and access to government content by citizens, as well as the corporate users of the information out there. That's something that the result of that is that they are increasingly in possession of information about how that content's being used, how that data is being used. They're increasingly tracking the kinds of use, or tracking who's using it, how much it's being used, and the kinds of uses that are being made from it. So increasingly they're in a position not just to aggregate more government content, but to provide more tools that people need to use government content. So it seems that that's a big challenge. Also, aside from the private market-oriented organizations, the volunteer civic-minded organizations like the couple of the ones that John Bracken mentioned this morning, the people doing the doxing, the Mikvah Challenge people here in Chicago that help young people figure out how to expunge their conviction or arrest records and those kinds of things. That's public data. Those are tools for the use by citizens of public data. That's a very interesting role that's being played by these organizations, and that will only increase as the amount of public data, amount of government data that's made public increases. Organizations like the Texas Tribune and Politico, or not Politico, ProPublica, the media organizations that routinely and very quickly harvest and analyze and visualize and expose government information, interpret government information for people. That's the root. They're in the supply chain now, and I don't think they're going to go away, seems to me. Even Wikileaks, as we talked about yesterday, and the and organizations that work with Wikileaks and with Snowden, like the Washington Post and the Manchester and the Guardian in the UK. These organizations are in the supply chain for access to government information now in a big way. It's Wikileaks Revelation, their disclosure of State Department cables was obviously much quicker. I mean, from the National Archives is still, and the State Department are still just beginning to disclose cables from the 1970s. WikiLeaks was a real shortcut. Clearly, WikiLeaks is not the new National Archives, but they are. And we wanted to have Julian Assange here today, but he couldn't get out of the Bolivian embassy or Ecuadorian embassy. But I think one of our challenges is to recognize these reroutings of the supply chain where they are. I mean, it used to be it all used to go through us. It all used to go through the Chicago Public Library. It all used to go through the Federal Repository Libraries. It all used to go through research libraries that bought microfilm of the census, the 1950s, or the census from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. We were in that supply chain, at least for scholars, and to a large extent for the public citizen. That supply chain has been radically altered now, it seems to be, and that's not a terrible thing, but it does bring up the question. It does raise the question. All right, then what is our role as research libraries? Do we not have a role in that supply chain? I don't think so. I mean, I think that we play a very, very important civic role, and that role is not going away. Number 7, a real problem is the non-transparency of some of the systems and operations that are in that supply chain now through which people are getting government information. The fact that we don't understand the way ProQuest content is being archived by ProQuest. We don't know enough about it. question was prompted, Carmelita's question earlier today. Why is it not in Portico? What is ProQuest doing to ensure the long-term integrity of a large amount of content, which obviously is important to their bottom line as well as to our constituents? We don't know enough about those systems, and because a lot of them are proprietary. We don't know a lot about the government systems either, the government systems. Robert Lee talked a little bit about the governments of China and Russia, some of our favorite actors out there that are play a very interesting, curious role in the accessibility of information from those governments. Some of those roles are quite different than the roles that our government agencies have played, and those are going to be challenges for libraries, quote, collecting that material and preserving that material in the future. In the past, we had agents on the ground in different places, in Nairobi and in Cairo and in Delhi, Islamabad, places like that could scoop up what the government published, that kind of thing. Not so easy anymore. It's a much more complicated picture. Also, not just and with the systems, we also don't know much about the finances of the organizations and how the money works. Thomas Blanton said yesterday about following the money. And it's really difficult to follow the money, as the National Security Archive people have found out, that the way a number of these organizations operate, it's not in their best interest to disclose how the money works, what kinds of profits are being made on the commercial databases, those kinds of things, what kinds of costs there are in developing these databases. Although Susan Boeckern made it very clear this morning in talking about the amount of time and energy and resources and money ProQuest has to put into even gathering up documents that the U.S. federal agencies ought to be organizing and maintaining, but are not. So these are the finances of this we don't know enough about. So economic transparency, or lack of economic transparency, is a big challenge. So I think I've totally exhausted my brain on in terms of, or my sense of the threats and challenges. With that, I would like to welcome or invite up to the podium the participants in our next session, which is really the key session for us. It's the session where we figure out, all right, as research libraries, what's our role? What do we do now that all of our templates and models for preservation and long-term maintenance of information and evidence have been totally shattered and upended? What do we do next? What not can we do, but what ought we to do? What is the role that research libraries play in the large civic environment in which we operate?